Merry Saturkwanzukah, everyone! Welcome to the Christmas 2018 edition of Lights Out, your virtual campfire. I'm your hostess with the mostest reindeer games, Sylvia Shults. It's time once again to gather around the solstice fire and share some ghost stories. You know I've got plenty of them, but this time, as always, we're going to concentrate on tales that bring the shivers to December. Open the next door on the Advent calendar, and let's go lights out. The first two stories in this episode come to us from Mason Winfield's book, Spirits of the Great Hill, More Haunted Sites and Ancient Mysteries of Upstate New York. Niagara Falls, Clet Hall. Niagara University was founded in 1856 as the Seminary of Our Lady of Angels in what was then the town of Suspension Bridge, the northernmost part of today's American Niagara Falls. The alleged haunt is on Monteagle Ridge, the highest point on the Niagara Gorge. Given such sublime vistas and medieval-esque atmosphere, it's little wonder that stories would fly about Clet Hall. In the conflagration of December 5, 1864, the unfortunate Thomas Hopkins, a seminary student from Brooklyn, met his maker a few decades early. A fast-moving fire broke out at 2:30 in the afternoon in the philosopher's room of the seminary, which was the forerunner of Clet Hall. According to the Lockport Daily Journal and Courier, the fire started with a stovepipe that passed through the ceiling. Dry and made of wood, the afflicted wing was entirely destroyed. The ever-zealous young Hopkins had been too devoted in his efforts to save property. He should have thought about saving himself. He was buried under a collapsing wall. Niagara County historians have heard of the famous haunting. Direct experience of it is more or less a rite of passage for Niagara University freshmen. Hopkins lives in the attic. Clay Graduate Hall director Marty Burke told the Buffalo News. The business administration major noted poltergeist phenomena like faucets turned on in totally, as in summer, empty buildings. More trademarks of the friendly spirit are footsteps in the halls and doors opening, sometimes to laughter. Nevertheless, Burke points out, it's eerie. The spook seems to have the run of the building. Sometimes, according to the folklore, moving from room to room spooking people. Outbreaks of Hopkins hijinks seem to happen all over the building on the same nights. Clanking sounds, like the proverbial rattling chains, come from below the theater. Clet Hall custodian Don Hathaway confided to the News that he has been frightened. Other students note lamps in their dorm rooms seeming to turn themselves on and off. It's the usual poltergeist checklist, different, if at all, in the faith of the believers. There is a surprising lack of apparitions. We don't doubt there may be some reports, but we've heard of no instances in which the resident spirit has made himself visible. This may be a poltergeist, not a ghost, for all the folklore. On the grassy knoll between Clet Hall and Route 104 is a simple white stone obelisk, the monument to poor Thomas Hopkins, once, according to an old account, the most promising of the 180 seminarians of his day. If his persistence is any sign of anything, he displays that promise to this day. Lockport, Tale of the Tailor. One Thursday evening in early December, the family of William Shack returned to find windows in the front of the house broken, and parlor carpet and woodwork smeared with something the papers delicately called filth. It was of the intestinal variety. Shack's 9-year-old daughter and a young German woman had been in a room of one wing of the house. Neither had heard anything. Suspicion included human agents, since furtive vandalism of the sort had happened before in Lockport. Things were calm for a stretch, but at around 9 in the morning of the following Saturday, a shrill whistle in the parlor summoned the family to find that the clothes folded on the sofa before ironing had been thrown about. No human could have done this and escaped notice. More wonders were to come. Later the family gaped as the kitchen pump handle flew up and down, as if being worked by a phantom. The pump was in good order and the cistern full, but the spout was dry. As they peeled potatoes in the kitchen, the German girl and the family daughter saw each other's dresses turn to tatters, cut without their notice in diamond shape, according to one of the newspapers. As they rushed to tell the mother, they saw a black animal in the shape of a toad on the cover of the dinner pot. It vanished as they neared it, but when they raised the handle, the dinner had also been strewn with filth. A new hat and a fine dress were found upstairs, removed from storage and laid on a bed, the feather from the hat cut in two. They were put away, but found later in a different room, the hat mangled inside out, the dress cut to shreds. One girl went to the clothesline and came back crying that her finger was cut off. There was indeed a deep cut, but it never bled, healed quickly, and caused her few problems. The garment from the line, though, was cut into pieces. The papers alluded to half a dozen more incidents from between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., untraditional hours for ghostly activity. After that, the visitation seemed over. We'll travel back to the grand old Victorian tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas for this next story. It comes from the book The Screaming Skulls and Other Ghost Stories, the collected true tales and legends of Elliot O'Donnell, ghost hunter for more than half a century. That's kind of useful, I think, to have the author describe himself within the title of his own book. The story is titled The Veiled Ghost of Highgate. There was standing, when I was young, in the vicinity of Highgate, North London, a quaint, rambling red-brick house with a moss-grown courtyard in front. Inside were large, gloomy rooms and dark staircases and passages. The owner of the house resided abroad. No one lived in it for long, and the following traditional story was associated with it. Towards the end of the 18th century there were living in the house a Mr. Bruce, his wife and daughters. Charles, the only son of Mr. Bruce, and a wild and reckless youth, had been living in Paris for 2 years when he suddenly returned home, so ill that he had to be put to bed, and Miss Black, a nurse, engaged to attend him. On her arrival Miss Black was shown into the invalid's room. The furniture was of the handsome, heavy kind characteristic of those times. The paneling on the walls was black with age, the fireplace supported by massive buttresses. The large curtained bed in which Charles lay stood in the center of the floor, and an oil lamp glimmered on a table. Miss Black replenished the fire, which was low, and sitting down at the table started to read the Bible. She had been instructed to keep very quiet. Now and again blasts of wind shook the leafless branches of the great trees in the garden, while snow spluttered on the embers as it was wafted down the wide chimney. Curious to see her patient, Miss Black gently pulled aside the curtain round his bed. Contrary to her expectation, he was not asleep, but lay motionless on his back, his bright blue eyes glaringly fixed on her face, his underlip fallen, mouth apart, cheeks a perfect hollow, his long white teeth projecting fearfully from the shrunken lips, whilst a bony hand, covered with wiry sinews, was stretched on the bedclothes. He was not a pleasant sight. Miss Black quickly returned to the table, leaving the curtain still drawn aside. About midnight the patient began to breathe heavily, and seemed to be very restless. Turning to look at him, Miss Black was greatly surprised to see a closely veiled woman seated in a chair near the head of the bed. Miss Black was about to move when the woman motioned to her to keep her seat. Miss Black could not see the woman's face owing to the veil, but she got the impression that she was young and good-looking. She was slender and rather tall, and wore a light green dress. She had gold earrings, a large gold locket and chain, and a massive gold bejeweled bracelet of curious workmanship, all of which sparkled in the lamplight. Miss Black concluded that the woman was a relative. Charles Bruce, who had become more than ever restless, heaved and sighed and seemed in great distress. Miss Black was rising to go to him when the woman again motioned to her to remain seated. The heat from the fire made Miss Black drowsy, and she dozed for a few minutes. When she awoke, the woman had gone. At the same hour the next night, the same thing happened. Miss Black was reading at the table when, on looking at the bed, she saw the veiled woman sitting beside the patient. She got up, and, undeterred by the repellent action of the woman, approached the bed, whereupon the woman rose and moved slowly and noiselessly toward the door. The face of her patient terrified Miss Black. Deep drops of sweat were on his brow, and his lips quivered as if in agony. His glaring eyes followed the receding figure of the woman, who mysteriously vanished just before she reached the door. The strain she had undergone watching the sick man and the strange woman was so great that Miss Black told the Bruces she could not stay another night in the house. It was only after the doctor implored her to remain that she very reluctantly yielded. The next night was Christmas Eve. It was bitterly cold, but dry. The wind moaned and sighed and rattled the ill-secured shutters, generating dismal echoes in the gloomy passages of the old building. At the same hour as on the previous nights, the veiled woman suddenly appeared by the bed of the invalid. His gasping and heaving made Miss Black's heart sicken, and when, in spite of the warning hand of the strange woman, she approached the bed, the corpse-like features of Charles became horribly convulsed, his eyes starting from their sockets. Miss Black spoke, but there was no reply. She touched him very gently. He was cold with terror and unconscious of any object but the mysterious woman. Thinking her patient was going to expire, Miss Black was about to go for assistance when the woman bent over Charles, who made a feeble effort to keep her away. Miss Black ran at once to the woman, whose clothes were very wet, although the weather was dry, and, obeying a sudden impulse, raised her veil. There was no face under it, only a blank. The shock Miss Black received was so great that she fainted. She was found in the morning, lying on the floor, only half conscious. Charles Bruce lay stiff and lifeless, one hand across his eyes, as if to shade them from some object he feared to look on. The other hand gripped the coverlet. That same morning, it was later discovered, the body of a foreign woman, young and beautiful, in a green dress, with gold earrings, a gold locket and chain, and a massive bejeweled gold bracelet of curious workmanship, was washed ashore on the Kent coast. She had been in the water 3 or 4 days. Her identity, if known to certain people in England, was never divulged. The Bruces left the house soon after the death of Charles, and never returned. It was shortly after their departure that the house was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a young man, supposedly Charles Bruce, who was seen and heard wandering disconsolately in the dead of night from room to room, along passages and up and down staircases, ever seeking companionship and sympathy, and finding none. I hope you've enjoyed this year's adventures in the dark side of the holidays. Remember, you can find many, many more stories in my collection Spirits of Christmas, found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold. In the next episode, we'll take a trip to Chicago to visit Mount Carmel Cemetery, final resting place of gangsters and Italian brides. Are you brave enough to stand at Al Capone's grave and go lights out?